Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is Colonial Latin America, Part 2. And we're going to talk about 5 terms that you should be thinking about as you read your books. And the hope is that these terms will help you to kind of get a better sense of understanding really the complexities of colonial Latin American life. All right, so let's dig in. Number 1, African slavery. Now, African slavery is a topic and a field of study that has been covered by many scholars across the world. The sad reality, of course, being so many different nations were tied and complicit in this horrific and difficult institution. When we are thinking about the enslavement of peoples from Africa and the institution of slavery that developed here, because again, there's many different kinds of slavery institutions. This happens to be one. Of course, all are terrible and brutal. But we're talking end of the 16th century, early 16th through the end of the 16th century, up into the 19th century when it comes to, as it relates to Latin America. But the use of enslaved peoples in laboring systems and practices really across Latin America as colonial Latin America is developing was a very prominent aspect of this period of Latin American history. Now, primarily when we're thinking of this, we're thinking of places like modern Cuba, we're thinking of places like modern Brazil. And Brazil in particular is kind of the big one here, as 2/3 to 3/4 of all enslaved individuals out of the continent of Africa, their final destination is Brazil. The role of these individuals in shaping the cultures around them, and also the multiracial societies that develop sort of with them is central. And of course, their role in further tying these colonial communities to a now growing Atlantic world is something that we need to also recognize. 2, quilombos. Now, the term itself relates to or means escaped slaves or escaping slaves in Brazil. Now, the process of resistance and escape differed depending on what colony you're talking about, right? So if we're talking about British colonies in North America in the 18th century, resistance, of course, was daily and common, but escape was far less common, and the establishment of slave communities was even further less. But in parts of modern Mexico, Mexico certainly, but more so, Brazil and elsewhere, the creation of escaped slave communities, these Quilombo communities, and Cimarron or Maroon communities was a part of this process. It was a big part of this. Given the nature of the locations and geography, etc., it was possible to establish a settlement. Palmares would be a good example, of course, in Brazil. All right, number 3, casta paintings. All right, so by the time you get into the end of the 17th and throughout the 18th centuries, you have, of course, this racialized structure, really, of life and of colonial society in the Americas. And with one's racial identity, of course, came different rights and privileges, or lack thereof. And these are depicted in the 18th century in a series of paintings that are typically designed to kind of demonstrate where an individual would rank in terms of class or in race. So are they mestizo? Are they Creole? Right? Sort of where does one fit in? Where is one's identity? And so these casta paintings, again, hint, hint, casta, are a big part of this. All right. Number 4, War of Spanish Succession. Right, so the Spanish are the individuals who are creating a large portion of these colonies, in addition to the Portuguese. In the early 18th century, beginning in the early 18th century, there is a war to put a new leader in power in Spain. And this is undertaken by Louis XIV in France. And the end result of this is going to be a series of reforms in New Spain that will result in quite a lot of crackdowns and opposition by the end of the 18th century. These are called the Bourbon Reforms. But they come to an end until something called the Treaty of Utrecht, right around 1713 or so. All right, 5th point for us to know, gender and class. So in your books, you're going to read a lot about the roles of women and kind of how they acted in the public sphere and how their contributions worked and shaped parts of life experience in colonial Latin America. That's awesome and wonderful, and that needs to be recognized even more than it already is. But we need to also recognize that on the basis of one's race or class, that role differed. So, for example, an elite woman who would have been considered of a much higher class is going to have a different experience than, say, perhaps a free black woman or an indigenous woman who is impoverished. Yes, they're still all women, but the experiences of what's going to be allowed for them in the public sphere, the kinds of life that they're going to have in the private sphere, they're going to vary a bit. And it's important for us to be able to recognize that when we talk and think and act about women's roles. We need to, in the colonial era, we need to often and always be seeking to understand the diversity of those roles. Thanks so much.